Governments across the Middle East, and the GCC in particular, are facing the dual challenge of meeting increased demand for public services and elevating the quality of these services to their citizens. While traditionally relying on direct public service provision or on outright privatization, governments have now a new tool at their disposal, public-private partnerships or PPPs, to help them deliver more efficient and more effective services. Like any other tool, this is not the magic solution to all problems. If applied appropriately, it can lead to benefits and success. If abused or not used properly, then projects are most probably to fail. This paper presents the perspective on public-private partnerships and how best to leverage their capability to help governments deliver public services. The discussion about PPP is critical for the MENA region because of the sheer size of the problem at hand. The region is expected to spend close to $1.5 trillion on infrastructure projects alone over the coming decade. This means governments need to have the delivery capability, and government agencies need to build the delivery capability to meet this challenge. Alone, probably this cannot be possible. Governments will need to rely on alternative models of service delivery. While historically relying on public sector provided services because of the public nature, good nature of these services, from telecom to energy to transportation and water, we are seeing an increased adoption of PPP. For example, many countries like Abu Dhabi, like Saudi Arabia, are adopting IPPs in their energy sector. Also, we are seeing more participation of the private sector in the transportation through building road networks and even operating these networks. Telco has been the oldest sector to be open for private sector participation and even outright privatization. However, public investment in infrastructure and direct public delivery of services has proven to be inefficient and required finding alternative sourcing as well as funding mechanisms for these services. This has many reasons. One, due to inefficiencies, increased demand that the private public sector alone couldn't meet, and the lack of accessibility and choice. Building on international experience, governments can leverage the private sector to deliver assets and services in different ways. Starting in the early phases of the 1950s with pure public sector provision, governments started to rely increasingly on outsourcing and traditional procurement, but this didn't deliver the full power of the private sector. In the 80s and 90s, a wave of privatization engulfed the world. This created more competition, this introduced more players into the market and helped develop many sectors. The telecom sector is a case in point. But privatization meant that government had to relinquish control over the asset. This might be appropriate for certain types of infrastructure or services, while it might not be fully feasible for other services. Hence the need for the PPP, which balances how much government relinquishes of control while maintaining a role in the service delivery and monitoring. Starting with the quadrant of highest risk incurred by government while maintaining a high level of government ownership, which is the public sector provision, governments moved to outsourcing or traditional procurement. This helped governments transfer some of the risk, the execution risk, to the service provider, but not fully. Then the privatization liberalized the market with no government intervention or minimal government intervention, and thus lowest risk. But also with that came the relinquishing of control over some assets or assets that could be considered strategic. A better model is a model that balances the risk incurred by governments as well as balancing how much influence they can maintain over the asset at hand. And PPPs are, while most commonly used in infrastructure, we are increasingly seeing them in social infrastructure, such as education and healthcare. For example, in the UK, prisons are privatized. Increasingly in the region, housing services which have been provided mainly through government agencies are being outsourced and or at least delegated to third-party private sector and developers and financiers. Education and healthcare are also other domains for PPP playing. Governments can consider PPP for various economic, technological, fiscal, and political reasons. It is critical for governments to the success of the PPP initiative to be clear on the objectives or the drivers for PPP adoption. For example, on the economic front, PPP can help provide faster access to more reliable services. Also, it can help accessibility to new technologies and train local capabilities. Moreover, PPPs can help free public funding to other destinations of funding, and if applied appropriately, it can also achieve efficiencies and cost savings. So, in comparison with other forms of private sector participation, PPPs enhance efficiency while allowing to share risk. This is in direct contrast with traditional procurement, whereby the public sector has direct control over the service, but it bears most of the risk, if not all of the risk, of funding, of operating, of ensuring the quality, to full privatization, where true, you can leverage the private sector capabilities and dynamism, but also you would lose the control over some strategic assets. Public procurement and privatization could be suited for certain types of services, while PPPs could provide an alternative for services whereby government wants to minimize its risk while maintaining some levels of control over the infrastructure. So it makes projects more affordable, it maximizes the use of private sector skills, it allocates the risks in a balanced manner between the private sector provider and the customer, which is the government entity. There are various forms of PPPs, ranging from the simpler management contracts up to build, own, operate models. And there are various cost recovery approaches whereby the private sector operator can be compensated, from tolls to grants to ancillary services, as well as service availability payments, whereby all these payment methods can help bridge the objective of, from government to the incentives provided to the operator in order to ensure better alignment and enhance service delivery. However, PPPs require an effective institutional setup. You need a clear and transparent regulatory environment. The regulations must be very clear. For example, when the competition was introduced to the telecom market, the regulatory authorities were established and the appropriate regulations were set in place to remove any potential risk or at least ambiguity from the operators. Also, we need effective administration. PPPs or privatization, or PPPs to that matter, do not mean that there is less role for government. It just means that there is a different way or a different role for government. Government, to ensure successful and efficient PPP implementation, they need to build effective management and administrative capabilities and procurement processes. Also, we need transparent and efficient legal environments, as well as a supportive economic environment to ensure macroeconomic environment to support the political stability, to develop stable markets and attract financial source funding for the projects. PPP projects entail different types of risks. 6 are most prominent, and these need to be allocated appropriately to the party best capable of handling them. For example, governments and the private sector can share the demand and revenue risks, whereby whereby the public could offer some guarantees to the private sector on a minimum level of demand to remove the risk, for example, or to minimize them. However, the private sector is better equipped to deal with design and construction risks, as well as operating and maintenance risks. This equitable or balanced distribution of risk between the two players ensure maximization of the value for money, because each party would handle the risk that it is best equipped to deal with and reduces the overall cost of the project, for example, in higher risk premiums imposed by the service provider in order to mitigate certain risks. And this entails a more partnership-oriented spirit of negotiation and contractual arrangements. There are 4 general success factors that need to be considered to make PPP projects successful. 1, there needs to be an integrated business case. You need to optimize the economic interests of all participants. It's not just trying to maximize the interests of the private sector or the public sector by squeezing the prices from the private sector. There are many ways of achieving efficiencies while maintaining the interests of both parties. It needs to take an accurate long-term planning or perspective. There needs to be a long-term financial engagement. There needs to be realistic forecasts and also a longer term of spirit of cooperation. There needs to be transparency with clear and measurable performance indicators linked to the objectives intended from the project. Also, there needs to be a knowledge transfer and know-how participation while facilitating private competition. Also, and most importantly, there needs to be an optimized risk allocation to utilize the strength of each party and minimize the overall risks and costs of the project. That said, the PPP is not the magic solution, because there are many examples from around the world about unsuccessful PPP implementations, whether due to misallocation of revenue risks or due to more aggressive forecasts of demand or the financial benefits of the project, or even the optimistic demand forecast, for example. PPPs mainly fail due to misallocation of risks, weak procurement process, and financial difficulties. From the private sector angle, PPPs offer an attractive opportunity for investment. Returns average 10 to 15%, whether from airports, roads, rail, to schools and healthcare provisioning. It also helps the local private sector gain expertise by opening the door of partnering with international operators and building local capabilities that could potentially be exported to other markets. PPPs allow the local private players to access best-in-class technologies. They enhance and build new capabilities in managing and operating complex assets and services. They also leverage the partnership to extend internationally, forming a driver for further economic growth for the local economy. In addition to the benefits to the financial sector, as the financial sector in the region accumulates assets and deposits, they need to find ways of disposing of them or investing them. And PPPs allow the banking and the financial institutions to channel the funding to profitable projects and encourage the economic cycle.